So hello. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk with you about things that I like talking about. I often don't have an audience, so I am very pleased to have one so that you'll listen and engage with me as I talk about some of our pioneers that we hear very little about, that many of us have no ideas about, although many of you probably do. So as I talk, I'm going to ask that you participate with me because while I know some things, I'm sure you have something to contribute, and I'd like for you to do that as we talk. So let me say, it's been 40 plus years since I have been in Chicago and at SSA. 40 plus. I look good, don't I? So this is like an opportunity to come home without snow and to just talk about some people who developed a parallel system of social work, social welfare across this country during the early part of the 1900s. So I'm going to show you photographs, and I'm going to talk about these people from the photographs, and again, ask that you participate with me. So this parallel system that I'm going to talk about involved the National Association of Women's Clubs. So African American women became reformers and developed social work, social welfare services during the Progressive Era, and a little before the Progressive Era. And they were followed by the sororities and the fraternities in the African American community. So we have a clear history of social work, social service, development and delivery that somehow doesn't get discussed in our text. So we're going to talk about it now. So I start with Mary Church Tyrell. So Mary Church Tyrell was a pioneer in the women's club movement. So much of the work she did was under the auspices of women's clubs. So look at her. So she grew up wealthy. Both of her parents were wealthy. Her father was Robert Church. Her father owned Beale Street in Memphis. You familiar with Beale Street? So it didn't look like that when Robert Church owned it. It was really the business commercial hub for the African American community. And Robert Church acquired all of this street during a yellow fever epidemic when people were fleeing Memphis and getting rid of whatever they owned for very little. So that's when Robert Church made his purchases. Mary Church Tyrell's mother was also independently wealthy, and they divorced. So she grew up very privileged, and she was a graduate of Oberlin College. And she graduated from Oberlin before Oberlin began to discriminate and segregate, because Oberlin didn't do that until after Plessy versus Ferguson. So when she matriculated at Oberlin, she had access to all of the other services and programs that anybody there had. So her experiences were often experiences of privilege, where she did not experience discrimination. Because of the way she looked, she could pass. She didn't make it a practice, but she didn't shy away from it if it was convenient. You know what passing is? Do I need to say anything else? Tell me. So, there were those of us in the African American community who had very little melanin and could easily pass for white, and many, many African Americans did and do. We don't make it a habit of outing people who pass because they can get killed. And because those individuals who could pass provided a service that those of us who couldn't pass needed. So Mary Church Tyrell would pass during those times when she was in segregated transportation. And it was uncomfortable and unattractive and smoky and dirty, and she would just sit in the ladies' car, which was reserved for white ladies. But she had a grandma who helped her to understand that she had an obligation to her people. And while she didn't experience directly a lot of discrimination, a lot of African Americans did, and kind of according to Du Bois's Talented Tenth, she was taught that she had an obligation to those individuals. So it was that prepared her to be an activist. And she was. She was an activist throughout her life. At age, I think around 77, she was still picketing segregated restaurants in Washington, D.C. She married Robert Tyrell, who was an attorney and a municipal judge in Washington, D.C. So she continued a life of privilege, but even with that privilege, she was an advocate. Actually, Booker T. Washington told her husband, "You need to muzzle your wife," because she was not one to be quiet. She was an activist and an agitator for change. So, do you have anything you'd like to add? Is there something that I've not said that needs to be said about Mary Church Tyrell?
She has a doctorate in what? It looks like Dr. Mary Church Tyrell.
If she has one, I don't know what it was in, and it could well have been honorary. Do any of you know? So you Google people, just look that up in a minute and share that with us. Anybody else? Yes. I'm sorry.
Can you explain what the women's club?
It was an organization usually called the National Association of Women's Clubs. These were women's ways of organizing across the country. They organized for planned change, for political activism, for developing social services and social welfare programs locally and nationally. Some people complained that they were a set of social butterflies on dress parade, and they looked good. They did dress up, but they were very clear and purposeful in terms of agitating and advocating for change. And so they kind of did what the communities around them needed, whatever they identified those things as being. Would you like to add anything? Anybody?
The doctorate was the 1948 Oberlin honorary.
Okie dokie. Thank you. And so when I think of Ida Bell Wells Barnett, I think of Chicago. So you probably know her. Interesting person. She's actually one of my favorite people. Raised hell all the time. A very impatient person. Not one to wait around and negotiate. She kind of believed that it was obvious. What needed to happen was obvious. This woman was a journalist. She owned at least 4 newspapers in her time. because owning newspapers was critical to have a mechanism for communicating, for sharing information. And the easiest and best way to do that was to have your own newsletter or newspaper. So she did own 4, and her, the most famous one, the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, was on Beale Street. And if you're ever on Beale Street, there is a historic marker for that newspaper. She was an anti-lynching crusader. You can download the Red Record, which she published to kind of chronicle lynchings across the country. She's an interesting person. She used her connection with journalists to get real stories about why lynchings had actually taken place. Because generally newspapers would kind of make up something, usually about African American men and white women as to why the lynchings took place. But Ida B. Wells Barnett relied on her relationship with journalists across the country. But she did something else unique. She hired Pinkerton agents to get information that she could not access. You remember Alan Pinkerton, the detective agency? Well, Alan Pinkerton, well, that was a guy named Alan Pinkerton who had detective agency, and Pinkerton had detective agencies who were African American as well as white, and she would hire those agents to go into those places where she would lose her life if she went, to get the real information about lynchings, why they had occurred. And that some of that content is in the Red Record. She also had a settlement house on State Street, the Negro Fellowship League and Reading Room. She kind of liked men a little better than she did women, so many of her services and programs were geared toward African American men. But she also started, I think it was in 1913, the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was a political organization for African American women in Illinois to give them the vote. Because as she said, white women suffragists were really aiming not to include African American women. So whatever it was they could do to not include those women, they did. So the Alpha Suffrage Club was a mechanism for making certain that African American women had a political organization that provided them information, that taught them the politics of what was going on so that they could be better informed and vote. Anybody want to add something to this Chicago? Although she was not a Chicagoan, but a lot of what she did in Chicago, in Illinois. Excuse me? She's really from Mississippi. So one other thing about this woman, she married Ferdinand Barnett, also an attorney, and an older gentleman, because she was kind of difficult. And so perhaps Ferdinand found that attractive. And she married Ferdinand. I think they had 4 children, and she immediately kept doing what she'd always done and just taking her children with her. There's something else I was going to tell you. I can't. Oh, she did say that one good way for African Americans to deal with institutionalized and structural racism was to have a Winchester Rifle in their homes at all times. And with that weapon constantly available, they would find themselves less likely to be harassed. She also, like Mary Church Tyrell, she signed the call for the formation of the NAACP. There were 2 African American women who signed that call. Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Mary Church Tyrell. There were 6 white women, like Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, Julia Lathrop, and I can't remember the others, who also signed the call for the formation. So they were the initial founding members of the NAACP. You might not be as familiar with Charlotte Hawkins Brown. Primarily thought of as a North Carolina pioneer, Charlotte Hawkins Brown established or founded Palmer Memorial Institute in Sedalia, North Carolina. It was a finishing school for middle-class African-American men and women. And I have a photograph of the Canary Cottage, and that was like the main house on the grounds of Palmer Memorial Institute. The Canary Cottage was where she kind of taught the students at Palmer Memorial Institute the social graces, because she sort of believed that if African Americans could master those social graces, then that would at least eliminate one reason for discrimination and exclusion. So to that end, she published The Correct Thing to Do, to Say, and to Wear. It's really hilarious. But it's not all bad. You know, it has some good content, and it has some kind of regular kinds of things that some of us were taught, that maybe people aren't taught those things. She had things like, when you enter the classroom, speak to your professor. You all do that all the time, right? So it was like, this is one of the things that one should do that's appropriate. It's just courteous. So she taught those kinds of things. Also, you know, how you hold the teacup in one hand and the crumpet in the, you know, those kinds of things. She taught those things as well. But what she also did was she organized African American women in North Carolina through those women's clubs. So while she founded Palmer Memorial Institute for middle class African American students, she also was a founder of Eflin Home. And Eflin Home was a training school for African American girls. North Carolina had a training school for black boys, and white girls. It had nothing for African American girls. They went to prison. So Eflin Home became the state training school eventually after she established it. Okay. Is there anything anybody'd like to add? Yes. Yes. The girls. Mm-hmm. Because there were no facilities for them. There was no training school. There was no option. It was just prison was the only option for them. And they were different from the crimes that are committed today. They were things like running away from home, being disrespectful. The literature says they were just sorry and worthless. I don't know what that means, but you could be incarcerated for those things. You know, if you were hanging around brothels, whether you were into commercial sex or not, you could go to prison just for being there. And so Eflin Home became that alternative so that these young women were not put in prisons. Mm-hmm. And note the hat. She was quite fashionable. Her papers say that her carnations on her suits always looked as though they were dripping with morning dew. So you know Asa Philip Randolph. Okay. So when I talk about social work, social welfare, I'm certainly talking about it in a broad term, which is the way all of our pioneers were described. As you think about social work and social welfare, our pioneers determined what it was. These individuals also determined what it meant. So Asa Philip Randolph was sometimes referred to as the most dangerous man in America. And he was referred to as being such a dangerous person because he was a labor organizer. So he was an organizer. That was what he did. He organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And the porters came to him to help them to organize. Now, I don't know about Illinois, but North Carolina is a right-to-work state. It's not a union state. You still risk your life organizing in North Carolina. But during the time that he organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, his life was in danger. And the porters' lives were in danger. The porters were African-American men who worked on the trains, the Pullman trains. There's a movie that's called 10,000 Men Named George. And it's about the porters and it's about organizing. And the movie's name tells you how little the porters were considered, because every Pullman car porter lost his name and his visibility. He became an invisible African-American image of George Pullman, because they were all called George, all of them. They didn't have names. They also had no bargaining power. George Pullman took very good care of people who worked for him, but not the porters. And these men, many of them were college educated because these were good jobs. They afforded them a good salary, a steady income, opportunities to travel and other things. So these were very good jobs, but they were not treated well by George Pullman. So they organized under Asa Philip Randolph's leadership. And he also had a journal that was called The Messenger that he started with Chandler Owens. And that messenger, the messenger, became the literary organ for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Again, the importance of having your own organ to communicate in writing to your audience. Okay. Asa Philip Randolph's name is also associated with the March on Washington, because he was a founder, organizer for the March on Washington in 65. Is that right? In 63. But what happened was that he approached FDR about labor issues, and FDR reached a compromise with him so that there would not be a March on Washington. I think this was in 41. So what FDR did was said, I will desegregate defense labor so that African Americans can have access to some of those contracts if we don't have a March on Washington. So later, I think it was 48, he approached Truman. We're going to have a March on Washington for freedom and jobs. And Truman issued an order that said, we will desegregate the military, the Air Force, the Marines, the Army, if we don't have a March on Washington. So it was in 63 that the march finally took place after these concessions. Now we're talking about this man who approaches two sitting presidents and says, if you don't do this, we will do this. So you have to say, he was dangerous. Somebody perceived him to be very dangerous. And then you have to look at the changes in terms of institutionalized structural oppression, the changes that took place because of this one man who said, if this doesn't happen, this will happen. Imagine that. When I think about what I have done, what I do as a professional social worker, and then I think about what these people did with far less, it makes you not whine. You know, it makes you just go do the work you're supposed to do and say, okay, what else do you want me to do? What else do I need to do? Because compared to what these people did, I'm really not doing as much as I ought to be doing. And so I love to talk about these people because just talking about them motivates me to do more, to do better, to be a better advocate, and to pay more. Ooh, North Carolina. My state is just a national embarrassment, but I don't want to talk about it. But you know, I don't have to. All you have to do is just turn on the news, and there we are. But it does make you. It makes me feel the need to do more, to do better. Anybody want to add any Asa Philip Randolph content? Yes, please.
Two things, and I'll say this speculatively, so if people think I'm wrong, let me know. First, I want to say J. Edgar Hoover or somehow the government had a file on A. Philip Randolph.
Absolutely.
Okay, so they had a file on him.
Yes, they did.
And then also, again, speculatively, I think he might have been a mentor for Bayard Rustin, and Bayard Rustin is one of the people that's credited for putting together the 1963 March on Washington, and Bayard Rustin is also the person who introduced Dr. King to a lot of Gandhian concepts about nonviolence.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So you may think nobody has a file on you. But people watch you. And I think putting it mildly would be to say that many of these organizations had people who infiltrated, that the FBI sent. And so sometimes you go, what is that people say about paranoia? What is that phrase? I may be paranoid, but... That's what it is. That's what it is. So thank you. Yeah, the FBI did have a file on him and a file on many of these people that I'm talking about. If you think of anything that we need to share, please do that. So this is Elizabeth Ross Haynes. And over next to her, that's her husband, George Edmund Haynes. And this guy sitting down here in color is their grandson, Dr. Bruce Haines. So this is George. So I'm going to talk kind of about George and Elizabeth Ross Haynes together, and I'll go back to her. So I did my dissertation on George Edmund Haynes. Yes, I did a historical dissertation. I learned a bunch of stuff. Even though I have 3 degrees in social work, I learned some things I had never heard of in terms of the development of my profession. So George and his wife graduated from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. They were Fiskites. And George was the co-founder of the National Urban League. His wife, Elizabeth, affectionately called Rossie, Elizabeth Ross Haynes, did much of her work around women and labor issues. She got her master's in sociology from Columbia, and she wrote a dissertation on women in domestic service. That work kind of stood as the seminal work for 50 years thereafter, before someone else began to research that same population. George was the first African American to graduate from Columbia School of Social Work. His doctorate, political science and economics from Columbia. and their grandson, Dr. Bruce. So I did my dissertation on George Haines. And so as I'm doing this work, I asked individuals, tell me about him. Who in the Urban League knows about him? Where are their children? And I found out belatedly that they had one son who was also a social worker, got his master's at Atlanta University. And so I'm still asking people, tell me, there have to be family members someplace, tell me about, and I wrote my dissertation a long time ago, but maybe about 3 summers ago, I got a call from Dr. Bruce Haines. And he said, I understand you do a lot of work on my family. And it's like, oh my God. So you go, please let me have gotten it right. Please don't let this be a lot of. So, and of course, as it turned out, I knew much more about them than he did, because you don't know your family the way that I did the research to learn who they were. And so since that time, Dr. Bruce, who is an urban sociologist and a faculty member at UC Davis, has begun to write a book about his grandfather. And Dr. Bruce shared with me that there were 3 of them, three boys, 3 grandsons. One, he's not sure where he is. One was killed, and he's the only one left. And then he told me that he grew up in the brownstone that his grandparents owned in New York, and he just sold it. And all I could see was dollar signs. It's like, ooh, Dr. Bruce, you made a lot of money selling that brownstone, didn't you? And so we kind of tried to keep in touch, because I know he has documents that he's not going to let me see until his book is published. But I did email him and say, I need some more contemporary photographs. Do you have any pictures? So he did send me this one of his grandmother standing on the steps. And I said, I want a photograph of your great aunt, Bertie Henrietta Haynes. Now, Bertie was the first African American to graduate from SSA. Bertie Henrietta Haynes. And so I've written about her in the Social Service Review, but I can't find a photograph of her. And Dr. Bruce said, I may have a photograph, but I don't know what she looked like. So I'm not sure that we'll ever get this information, but I also know that Dr. Bruce is holding things pretty close. So we'll see what happens. The National Urban League was a social work organization, and it was founded to help African Americans who were moving from the rural South to centers in the North, to learn to live in cities, to adjust to life in cities. You may not know this, but when you grow up on farms, and I did, you work until you can't see. It's dark, you really can't see. And then you get up early in the morning and you do it all over again. But when people moved to cities, there was suddenly all this leisure time. There was a different way of living. And so what the National Urban League tried to do was to help people to organize their lives in a way that was productive, to help them to find employment, housing, develop social services, etc. That's what the National Urban League was founded to do. George Haines was also a member of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. And I'm telling you that because it is really important to know African American sororities and fraternities if you are looking at services in local communities, because all of those organizations have national service mandates. So sometimes our agencies run out of resources. Creative social workers who are trying to help people meet their needs go to those agencies and organizations that exist. We need to know what they are and what they do. And those Greek letter organizations provide social services. They have a national service mandate. They have to. We have to help them to direct those services. We can do it from inside, or we can do it as not members of those organizations. But it's important that we know what they are. And if you know, the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity was founded in 1906. It was the first African-American Greek letter organization founded at Cornell. Most of them were at Howard, but that one was at Cornell. And he was not one of the original founders, but he was one of the earliest members. And if you look at the history of the National Urban League, and you look at who the executive directors have been historically, you'd be hard-pressed not to find an alpha in those leadership positions. So think about that. Okay. Anybody want to add anything? Any Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity men in this room? So usually when I talk about this and I put this man and another one on, there's always a member of that fraternity in the room who has a lot to say. This is Victoria Earl Matthews. So when I show these photographs to my students and I'm talking about African American social welfare pioneers, and they see Victoria Earl Matthews, and they say, well, Dr. Carlton-LaNey, I thought you were talking about African American pioneers. And I am. That's because race is a social construct, but okay. And I know y'all talk about that, and you can talk about that later, I won't. So she founded the White Rose Home for Working Girls. Not working girls, but working girls. Okay. The White Rose Home was a settlement house. So African American women who were personal servants and live-in maids often had one day off a month. So they lived with the people they served. So they didn't have housing. They just had this one day off. The White Rose Home became that space for these women to spend that one day. And they could get their mail there, and they could just kind of go there and kind of chill and hang out that one day that they had off. And so the White Rose Home provided lectures and a library. In fact, by the time the White Rose Home closed, its library was so extensive that it became a part of the Schomburg collection, the New York Public Library. Would you like to add anything? Anybody? How much time do I have? I have how much time? So I'll go on. Okay, so Marcus Garvey. So we generally think we know something about Marcus Garvey. But unless you know about the Universal Negro Improvement Association, you don't know much about Marcus Garvey. And if you look at community organizing and models for community organizing, and you look at the UNIA, you see kind of the perfect community organization. It's like community organizing scholarship could have looked at what Garvey did and the UNIA and then written what community organizing ought to be, because he modeled it. Marcus Garvey was brilliant. Now, see, Marcus Garvey wore plumes. So it doesn't take much for people to decide to devalue you and minimize you. So when you're, parading through Harlem with plumes on, it's like, He had a tremendous following, and the scholarship that you see that says a few thousand is really questionable. And they were not only working class, but they were middle class and upper middle class people who were members of the Garvey movement. And of course, there are still lots of Garveyites across the country in most communities today. Some of you may remember Mark Battle, who was a a pioneer in our profession. I did not know until he passed away that his name was Marcus Garvey Battle. His parents were Garveyites. That helps you to understand a bit about who he was, because it gives you a lot of information that you may not ordinarily have unless you know who Garveyites were and their influence. Is there anything anybody like? Yes? Dean.
Mark Battle was the president of the National Association of Social Workers for 20 years.
Yep. Did you hear? President of NASW for 20 years. Very active with the Council on Social Work Education as well. Because I think I'm running out of time. Unless you want to add something about Marcus Garvey. So don't think back to Africa movement. Think Universal Negro Improvement Association. Through that organization, Marcus Garvey decided he would build a doll factory that would make black dolls because he thought it was important that little black kids had black dolls to play with. We're talking about 1915, 16, 17. Okay. Now, I don't know about Chicago. In Durham, North Carolina, I am hard-pressed to find a black doll in 2016. It's having positive images of yourself contributes a lot to self-esteem, self-image, self-worth, self-concepts. But social workers know that. This is his second wife, Amy. His first wife's name was Amy as well. He liked Amy's, apparently. His first wife, Amy, and this Amy were friends. So his first wife, her name was Amy Ashwood Garvey. And they were married for about 3 years. They divorced in 1922, and in 1922, he married this Amy. So this, Madam C.J. Walker. Now, I love to talk about Madam C.J. Walker because, again, we think we know who she was. This woman made $1 million plus because she created skin and hair care products for African American women. She did not create the straightening comb, but she did create skin and hair care products, which was good. But in addition, she organized the Madam Walker Beauty Culturist League. So she gave employment opportunities. She allowed African American women to be independent business women. She gave them job opportunities, job options, options to being washerwomen and personal servants. They could become independent business women selling those products. And they sold those products door to door. And Madam Walker was training saleswomen and organizing saleswomen 2 years before Mary Kay was born. And she was giving prizes to those organizations that contributed the most to their communities. She taught these women to not just be independent business women, but to be political in what they did, to understand the politics that surrounded them, that dictated their opportunities, and to organize in ways that confronted that oppression. Anything? Yes.
I read where Madam C.J. Walker, that was not her real name,
Her name was Sarah Breedlove.
and then she changed her name to Madam because when she went to the banks and conducted her business, she wanted people to know
Absolutely. Thank you. Lugenia Burns Hope. Lugenia Burns Hope started the Atlanta Neighborhood Union, again, a community organization in Atlanta. She was married to John Hope, who was the president of Morehouse College, and she used the men students at Morehouse to help her to organize the communities. She also started the first social work education program for African Americans in Atlanta the year before Atlanta University opened in 1920. And her entire curriculum was kind of picked up and became Atlanta University's social work curriculum. Another thing was the Highlander Folk Center, which is a training, a community development training retreat area in Tennessee. The Highlander Folk Center is still there. The Highlander Folk Center also used her strategies to help community organizers during the 1960s. The Highlander Folk Center started around 1932 around labor issues, still exists, and has kind of changed its focus as community needs have changed. Okay. Would anybody like to add anything? This is Eugene Kinkle Jones, the second executive director of the National Urban League. Eugene Kinkle Jones is one of the founders of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. Eugene Jones, unlike George Haynes, if you notice the photograph of George Haynes, while he's handsome, he looks a bit anal. Well, Eugene Jones, on the other hand, was middle class. He had professional parents, far more suave and sophisticated. I also think he had a nice mustache, but he was far more comfortable interacting with people who were different than George Haynes. And because of that, he was able, I think, to make a few more inroads for the National Urban League. He was the second executive director. And Eugene Kinkle Jones was also a member of FDR's Black Cabinet.